All right, I think we are going to get started. So I want to welcome everybody to tonight's LaRouche PAC class. I'm Susan Kokinda in Detroit, and Tony Papert tonight is going to be presenting the first of a series of discussions under the headline of Death by Globalization, or a Renaissance of Our American System. I want people to step back for a second and recognize that we are in a time of very highly charged battles and issues. Some of the ones which are grabbing people's attention as we speak, of course, the fight over election integrity, the fight over COVID mandates, the chaos at the border. No one would argue that each one of those is not absolutely existential. If we don't have free and fair elections, then we're not a democratic republic. If we can't protect the sovereignty of our country and protect our borders, then we're not a sovereign nation. If our government insists on tearing up our basic rights, then we're no longer a republic. But I would, and these are issues that we delve into much more deeply in terms of our Monday strategic updates. And for those who may be joining us for the first time or joining us on YouTube, I encourage you to go to LaRouchePAC.com and make sure you're signed up for those Monday updates. But the world's elite looks at each one of these issues as an element in their war to eliminate sovereign nations and to eliminate the ability of those nations to protect, to protect and develop their people and their economies, as the preamble to our Constitution charges us to do, that is, to promote the general welfare for ourselves and our posterity. The elite know that their fight is ultimately one of two images of man. Man in the image of the Creator, with the ability to act on the universe, and the other as man is merely an animal who exists to be manipulated and in some instances culled. So the enemy is always fighting the long game. And that's why they so often outflank the good guys. Because when people get fixated on the short game or the immediate issue before them, it is very, very easy to be flanked. So we need to bring more people into the long game. That is, the fight to defend those principles and the fight to defend the governments and the policies which will defend man in the image of the Creator. And economics is absolutely central to that fight, which will be the subject of what Tony begins to develop tonight in ways which I think you will find very different than what comes to mind when you think of the word economics. But tonight's discussion has an action aspect to it. And that is the new initiative which LaRouche PAC has launched, a resolution to re-Americanize the US economy. The idea of this resolution is to expand the discussion into new layers, especially layers, productive layers in our society, who need to be brought together and need to be brought into the political fight, which is already raging to save our country. Now, I want to just very briefly show you from our website where the initiative and introduce it to you. As you can see here, it says, the following resolution is being circulated nationwide for endorsement by constituency groups and leaders, including student groups, elected officials, city councils, county boards, state legislators, clergy members, business owners, trade unions, and any other similar groupings or individuals. And the resolution makes very clear that it is an entire system of globalization and its sub-ideologies like monetarism and environmentalism, which has destroyed us, and that we have to overthrow that entire system and return to the American system of political economy. The concluding lines of this read, with American system policies, we can build our way out of the present crisis. This is the outlook that built our nation. It's an American outlook, and it is how we will free ourselves from the disaster of globalization and reshape our economy today. So I will be posting in the chat the link to that resolution. We are encouraging everybody on this call to take this and saturate the political discussion in this country with this vital question. Because again, the more of us who are fighting on this terrain, on the terrain of what the fight is truly all about, the harder it's going to be for the enemy to outflank us. Their greatest defense against the principles and ideas of Lyndon LaRouche, of the American system, their greatest defense has been to make sure that nobody knows about it or is thinking about it or acting on it. So I think that defines our task. And Tony tonight is going to start us through some basic training to get ready for that battle. So Tony, go ahead.
Terrific. Thanks so much. Yes, so the whole series we call Death by Globalization, or a Renaissance of Our American System. Now, the US and many other countries worldwide are presently suffering through what's called a supply chain crisis, which I think our watchers are aware of. I don't know how well aware, but we have probably now 100 ships waiting at sea or at anchor, because there's too many even to anchor outside the big West Coast ports, Long Beach and the adjacent port. We have containers piled up at railheads in increasing amounts because there's no transportation to take them away. The trucking isn't available. We have goods missing from stores and so forth. So this is being referred to as a supply chain crisis and the result of COVID-19. But in reality, it's not a supply chain crisis. It's much more. And it's not the result of COVID-19. COVID-19 was the trigger, or the measures taken against, or the measures taken on the occasion of COVID-19 were the trigger, but they were not the cause. And the proof of this is that in 2005, Lyndon LaRouche forecast exactly this crisis before COVID existed. And not only that, he said what has to be done about it. So it's that forecast, his reasons for giving it, what he said, what he prescribed, which is my subject tonight. Lyndon LaRouche, who died in early 2019, was famous for the accuracy of his forecasts, of which his economic forecasts, of which he issued about a dozen or a few less between the 1950s and around 2006. His purpose in these forecasts was not to gain fame as a fortune teller, but it was the same as his purpose in his 8 consecutive campaigns for the US presidency, which won him a large and deep following among the American people, which still exists, both in the people alive then, in many cases, their children and others. One way of saying it simply is what he said to me. I don't know if he said it to me or said it in print, but what he said once about his religious break with his parents. His parents were Quakers, and the difference, he said, came down to the fact that his parents believed that God is responsible for the condition of humankind on Earth. Whereas Lynn decided that what he believed was rather that God holds man responsible for the condition of mankind on Earth. And among others, God held him responsible for the conditions of mankind on Earth. So the purpose of the forecasts was, and the reason they were forecasts and not predictions, is because humans can change what they do. And in many cases, his forecasts were in effect a warning that if present bankrupt policies are continued, this is the result you're going to meet. Now, the forecast of this crisis, LaRouche made in 2005 on the occasion of reacquainting himself with some of the conceptions of the great Russian scientist Vladimir Vernadsky. This is Vernadsky in 1934. He was born in the 19th century. He died in 1945. He was the discoverer of the biosphere, not the word, but the concept of the biosphere and of a concept of the noosphere. Just to anticipate it, I mean, we'll explain both really as best I can, what the biosphere is, what the noosphere is. The bios is obviously familiar, meaning life. This noos, N-O-O-S, is Greek word meaning thought and human thought. And in this case, it means creative human thinking. So that's enough, I guess, for this picture. So confrontation, I intend through confrontation with the concept of the noosphere, as Lynn did, through the concept of the biosphere, to go back to basics about what we should think about what's called economics. And as Susan said, and I think you'll see, most of the university accredited economists and the people prating in the press about economics are really, they don't know even what the most basic concepts are. And what they're telling you has nothing to do with economy. And of course, typically, especially today, their forecasts, their predictions are all of them wrong and worthless. So we're going to first take the concept of biological life itself, as Vernadsky rediscovered it effectively in his concept of the biosphere, and use that to take up the contrast with human creative thought, or noesis. That's the same word, another form of the same word I used a minute ago, difficult word, which is the basis for economics, as Hamilton and Abraham Lincoln, Lyndon LaRouche understood economics, the American system of economics, even if your professors can't understand it today. Both of these things, life, as you'll be coming to understand it now, I think, and cognition or thought, are efficient in the real universe, but intangible to the senses. And now I'd like to, Susan, if she would, to put up a slide, which is my digest for the purposes of this discussion. I mean, it's not complete, but it's a digest for the purposes of this discussion of Vernadsky's ideas on the biosphere. And perhaps it'll be useful to have the whole thing before you as I talk about it. I'm going to use this also to take the contrasting, totally different, and yet in a way similar case of thought and the noosphere. So number one, of course, says life is a cosmic phenomenon, in some ways sharply distinct from non-living matter. Vernadsky attributed this view to the great Dutch scientist of the 17th century, Christian Huygens. Second, he said, life comes only from life. This has been said before, of course, all the way back to the Renaissance and maybe perhaps long before that, actually, among ancient thinkers who prefigured the European Renaissance. But what Vernadsky said, he maintained this throughout. He said that there's no instance ever been shown of life springing up from inanimate matter. And that scientists must accept this reality, and he always put it this way, scientists must accept this reality that life only comes from life, regardless of their religious preconceptions to the contrary. Now, it's a peculiar phrase, but he always said it here. He said this not as an atheist. I was discussing with Susan before the show. I mean, although he lived to approximately 25 or more years of his life in communist Russia, Vernadsky was not a communist, never joined the Communist Party, and in fact, he was a deeply religious man throughout, although not a member of an organized denomination. So he didn't say that as an unbeliever confronting believers, but he was confronting what he thought, or what he insisted was a religious-like prejudice that some way or other, life must be shown to come from non-living things, even though nobody has ever shown it in all this centuries of trying to do it. Then he said, rather than dealing with the concept of life per se, let's talk about living matter as the totality of living organisms, meaning the totality of living organisms on Earth. There, of course, may be living organisms elsewhere than on Earth. But these are living organisms within the biosphere, as we'll come to discuss that in a minute. So he says, this living matter is distinguished by its great energetic activity and its rapid selective exchange of matter with the biosphere. And he detailed in actual experimental investigations the way life chooses from among the many chemical elements of its environment in the biosphere, those which it will assimilate not only by chemistry, but even by isotope. That is, the distinctions in a given chemical element, which don't change its so-called chemical processes, but give rise to different isotopes based basically on different numbers of neutrons in the nucleus of the atom. So life selectively distinguishes all these things in its environment. He says it's a definite geological envelope of Earth, markedly distinguished from all other geological envelopes of our planet. This is the area of the planet in which life exists and with which life immediately exchanges matter and energy. So it extends throughout the troposphere, the lowest part of the atmosphere, to the surface of the Earth, throughout the oceans, and maybe 2 to 3 kilometers below the surface of the planet. And then he says The biosphere is the single greatest geological force on Earth. This, again, I'm saying he says, but much of this is not literally Vernadsky's words, but my digest of what he thinks from his various writings. In any case, he says it's the single greatest geological force on Earth, moving, processing, and recycling several billion tons of mass a year. And this, he calls, I didn't write it here, but a large part of this mass, which is the product of the biosphere, he calls fossils of the biosphere. Like all the biogenic rocks. I mean, you well know that fossil fuels, oil, coal, natural gas, are thought to be a biological origin. So they are the fossils of life, but similar of many other rocks. I mean, Vernadsky's original specialty was geology. So there's a great range of biogenic rocks. Then, of course, the atmosphere is created by life. It's oxygen, it's carbon dioxide, created and recreated by life. The ocean, which is swarming by life, is created by life, its composition created by life. So put all this together, and I guess you can see it's true. The biosphere is the single greatest geological force on Earth, moving, processing, recycling several billion tons, but living matter is only about 1/4% of the mass of the biosphere, which is itself only a small part of the mass of the Earth as a whole. The biosphere is the greatest geological force, and of course, the force in the biosphere is the energy of life or living matter. And then, I mean, within the biosphere, we have directed evolution, which is upward directed, which Vernadsky discussed in great depth in various publications. So the entire biosphere is a dynamic equilibrium. It's a developing system which is ever increasing its free energy. It's increasing in the thermodynamic scale, and it's never able to return to any previous state of organization. So, you know, that I say about the biosphere, which I think accurately reflects Vernadsky's views. Of course, there was a lot else he thought. He was thinking and writing for a long lifetime. And, you know, there was a lot else, other ideas that he developed. But I think this gives an adequate basic idea of the biosphere according to Vernadsky. Now, I mean, this also involves the question that it also involves other questions which are very thought-provoking, which I didn't take up, but I'll just have to answer, I think, rather quickly and move on, or comment or answer quickly and move on, which is that I began by saying, I think from Huygens, that life is a cosmic principle, and then added the statement from Vernadsky, which also Pasteur and others have said accurately, that, you know, life only comes from life. But to say it's a cosmic principle and life only comes from life means that the principle of life is universal and eternal and existed before, for instance, the formation of the solar system and the planets. So, you know, this is uncontestably true, but I don't think we can specify it as to form, and, you know, is another big question.
There is another question in the chat, which I think is very interesting. First thing he says is, life and matter is dependent upon motion or frequency. The book of John says, in the beginning was the word, and word equates to sound, which is frequency. Tony, I know you'll have something to say about that. The point he's trying to make, life did not come from primordial soup. There was a driving force. Frequency is invisible. The Holy Spirit is invisible, just some thoughts.
I mean, I think it's absolutely true. Or another way of saying, in the beginning, it's another word, but it's St. John, the Gospel of John says, in the beginning was the Logos, which the questioner translated word, and the questioner said word. But another way to express it is, in the beginning was the reason or the purpose. And it's absolutely true that they're all attempt. I mean, the rest of what the speaker said is incontestably true. I mean, scientists have been cooking this primordial soup for centuries, and it was never, it did anything of the sort of producing life, and it never will. So it's absolutely true. In the beginning was the word, if you like, or in the beginning was the reason or the principle, and not the primordial soup.
And we have another question in the Q&A. Your digest number 6, point number 6, says that the biosphere is the single greatest geological force on Earth. And then at the end of that section, you say that despite that, living matter actually comprises only about 1/4% of the mass of the biosphere. I'm confused by this. Are you saying that living matter is a reference to only currently living matter as opposed to the rest of the biosphere? Okay.
Yes, that's what it means. Currently living matter is only 1/4%. And then, you have the formerly living matter, which comprises part of the biosphere in that it's in exchange with living things, as in the ocean, in the lower atmosphere, and the soil, and so forth. And then you have fossils of living matter, which were once living matter, in Vernadsky's view of it, which are presently bio-inert, like granite, which don't have any participation with living matter, although they once formed part of it. And so these he calls the fossils of the biosphere, or the fossils of life. So hopefully that answers the question.
Good. I'm glad he asked that, because I was thinking the same question.
Yeah, great. Okay.
Good.
So now I want to go on to compare with, again, the big word and the noosphere, and use the same chart in which we just had up to discuss what is, similar and yet totally different, which is the noosphere. So I'd like you to put up that same, yeah, great. So I begin this, and I discussed it with Susan a little while ago, that in his work, Some Words on the Noosphere, which was written in 1944 and republished more recently in EIR, in English translation, I think the first complete English translation, Vernadsky said, here a new riddle has arisen. Here a new riddle has arisen before us. Thought is not a form of energy. How then can it change material processes? That question has yet to be answered. So so I mean, that I would put, as in effect, the first question that has to be considered before we can begin to consider the noosphere. Now, in reference to number one, life is a cosmic phenomenon in some ways sharply distinct from non-living matter. I mean, here we're talking not about life, but about the creation of ideas in the human mind, or ideas as they are created in the human mind. These form the driving force of the noosphere. And I mean, what I would substitute for 1 and 2 in this chart is to say new ideas are only created in creative mentation among human beings, or it might not among really. New ideas are created only within an individual human mind, to the best of our knowledge. There is no other species which thinks in that sense, among all other species known to us. Neither animals nor machines can think. Now, I mean, this question about machines, you know, it was settled many years ago, but you know, now, you know, there's discussion of things which are wrongly equated with human intelligence, such as artificial intelligence and so forth. I mean, to address that briefly, I think many of the people on heard me tell it, but I'm going to tell again a story I told once more in one of these classes, once in the past in one of these classes, which is, I'll abbreviate it. I came to Lynn to say, you know, can computers think? Many, many years ago, in perhaps 1969. Can computers think? And he said, oh no, they can't think. They could only think if the computer was aware of all the successive iterations and designs and ideas by which computers were designed in the past and improved into better computers. And if a computer was capable, which they're not, of knowing that in that way, only then could it think. And, you know, I mean, what this refers to is scientific thinking, in the first instance, like Einstein's thinking in developing the theory of relativity, or Planck in the quantum theorem, where Einstein had to confront new evidence which blew to smithereens established doctrines and say, well, we believed this, but it's clearly untrue. Now we can no longer believe it. How did we come to believe it? What was the evidence? Where did we go wrong? What should we have thought instead back then, as every person goes through? So, I mean, science and the history of science are one and the same thing. There's no scientist in that sense who's not a historian of science. So I'm going to leave it at that for this moment, that thinking, the generation of ideas, occurs only in an individual human mind. And then the two, I mean, again, for number two, life comes only from life. What corresponds to that in the question of the noosphere, or human thought, is that a thought can only arise with an individual mind. It can be communicated to another individual mind or other minds, but not directly. in a literal fashion, if it's truly a new idea. Because it can't, it's not a material object. You can't exchange it with somebody the way Robinson Crusoe exchanged goods with his savage friend. You can only induce it into existence in another person, which means you have to, in some way, encourage him, really it's up to him, to go through the same process of thinking you came to think of that idea, which was new or new to you. So it cannot be communicated through literal forms of communication. It requires, for instance, ambiguity, metaphor. There is no literal communication of an actual idea. And then, I mean, so the noosphere is the envelope of the human mind, that is the envelope of the earth, and now going out into, near Earth space, toward the moon, toward Mars pretty soon. But the envelope of the human mind, its products and the fossils of those products. And the noosphere is a greater force than the biosphere. And therefore, in fact, in our days, the noosphere is the greatest geological force on Earth, ruling over the biosphere and inorganic nature to a greater extent on Earth, even though, thought is intangible and weighs nothing. This intangible thought, which weighs nothing, through the noosphere, is the greatest force known to us ultimately over the span of time in the universe. And similarly, the development of the noosphere, and basically we're talking about the development of human society generally, and the physical economy is one of the organisms of the noosphere. So the noosphere is, as was said of the biosphere, it's a dynamic equilibrium of directed development, ideas which were developed thousands of years ago. The ideas which are developed thousands of years ago are active today and active in giving birth to new ideas within the minds of individuals. In a way, I'm tempted to now take more questions, and I'm sure there are more questions, but I think I should proceed and take all questions and discussion at the end. Because I want to finish this subject and allow for discussion. Now, so this is at least an attempt to communicate the concept of the noosphere through the biosphere. The concept of the noosphere here is really Lynn's. And even though Vernadsky went in that direction, and the biosphere concept is basically Vernadsky's. Now, what we've had increasingly and ever increasingly since '71, and especially in the 21st century, is the globalization project, which, of course, I mean, the way it's generally understood is spinning off production from high-wage, so-called advanced sector countries to low-wage developing sector countries. And I mean, in total, as the title of our series indicates, globalization has destroyed the United States. And, you know, I think everybody in this call is in a position to see it. Just to go through all the destruction would be extremely time consuming. But the United States of 2021 is far and away different from the United States of 71. Whole industries, towns no longer exist. And the standard of living has been continually degraded to the point where, as is true of many countries under globalization, the population can no longer even maintain itself by natural growth. And were it not for immigration, the United States would have been in population decline already for years, which is the least of it. But what Lyndon LaRouche in the 2005 paper I'm referring to, he picked up an aspect of this which is totally missed by the academic and accredited economists, even those, some of them, and some now do, who oppose globalization, and certainly the ones who support it, which is that, and this is because of the characteristic of the noosphere, in a modern economy, approximately half the true cost of production of anything is the indispensable basic economic infrastructure, which is consumed in the production and consumption of that item. So the basic economic infrastructure is, in effect, a directly noetic component of the process both of production and consumption. This can be very well expressed, and we'll do it, I'm sure, fully in this, I think fully in this class series, but this can very well be expressed using Lynn's conception, which he developed after this 2005 paper, of infrastructure as a series of platforms for the noosphere, really, for social life, production, reproduction, including the production and reproduction of the labor force itself. I mean, think of, for instance, electrification. Now, I mean, at the time when the Green New Deal, or the global Build Back Better Green New Deal of the World Economic Forum, would stop the process of electrification of sub-Saharan Africa, which is mostly not electrified. They would stop it by stopping new construction of new fossil fuel power plants. Look at what a change in production, in consumption, in life, in thinking was brought about by electrification, say in the United States over the course of the late 19th through really mid 20th centuries. Electrification is indeed, it's a basis for a totally new kind of production. It's a basis for a totally new kind of consumption, a new kind of household. It's a platform for economy, a new platform, a noetic platform of economy. So this is true generally of basic economic infrastructure, but the globalizers not only savage the wage portion of the price of the product, but even more so because, in part because they don't know any economics, savage the infrastructure portion. So admittedly, a certain amount of infrastructure is built up in less developed exporting regions, largely that necessary for the export. But the net of the world's total infrastructure is savagely depleted by globalization from the period of 71 through 2000, and then much more savagely, with the exception of the Trump administration, which stopped and reversed to the extent it could during the brief 4 years, much more savagely during the 21st century to date. Lyndon LaRouche summarized this in a paper, which we're going to put up a link later. Lyndon LaRouche summarized the whole story of globalization by writing, "The attempt to consolidate the form of imperialism called globalization is an attempt to rid the world once and for all of everything which modern European civilization had accomplished." So that was his summary of globalization. And then to go back to our beginning, he forecast in this 2005 paper that the worldwide destruction of infrastructure would culminate in a sudden, unexpected, nonlinear shock plunge, where the world economy would fall off a precipice into an unexpected physical economic breakdown due to the continual and worsening depletion of infrastructure by the process of globalization. So I think I'll close with that, which I put that on a slide, and I will read it as you read it. He wrote, so he's writing in 2005, and he's writing about a process which we could date, again, roughly from 1971, just 50 years ago. And he wrote, "Since the useful physical lifespan of much of the basic infrastructure on which modern life depends runs in the order of between 1 and 2 generations, the nearly 4 decades, now exactly 5 decades, of increasing neglect of replacement and repair of basic economic infrastructure has brought much of the world, North America and Europe most notably, to a much lower level of productive potential than during the 1960s. The time has come at which worn-out infrastructure and lost investment in modern agriculture and industry must be replaced rapidly on a vast scale, where there will be a sudden collapse of productive potential to levels far below that prevalent up to this moment." And then he repeats it in a different way. In terms of capital cycles, so the capital cycle he's talking about is 1 to 2 generations, or 1 to 2 times, let's say, 25 years, now 50 years from 71. This approach to the closing phase of a long-term capital cycle in relevant sections of the world now defines a precipice for the world economy as a whole during the times immediately before us. Unless there is a sudden, drastic shift back to heavy investment in basic economic infrastructure, the apparently slower long-term decline in economy experienced during recent decades will soon be jolted by a relatively precipitous rate of physical decline, even a collapse. So that's where we are at this point, what he predicted. And that's his guidepost for what we have to do.